The most haunting sound at the Family Feud studio that Tuesday afternoon wasn't something anyone else could hear. It was the rhythmic beeping that 67-year-old Charles Washington heard constantly in his mind, the phantom echo of the dialysis machine that had controlled every aspect of his life for the past 8 years. Charles walked through the bright Family Feud corridors with the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy between treatments, whose entire existence had been restructured around 3 days a week, 4 hours at a time, tethered to a machine that cleaned his blood because his kidneys could no longer perform that most basic function of human survival. Charles Washington's relationship with freedom had ended abruptly 8 years ago on a Thursday morning when his primary care physician had delivered the devastating news: end-stage renal disease. His kidneys, damaged by years of poorly controlled diabetes and hypertension, were functioning at less than 10% capacity. Without immediate intervention, he had perhaps weeks to live. The intervention, Dr. Rodriguez had explained with practiced compassion, would be hemodialysis, a process that would require Charles to spend 12 hours every week connected to a machine that would perform the work his kidneys could no longer do. 8 years later, Charles's life had been reduced to a rigid schedule that revolved entirely around his treatment days. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. at the Riverside Dialysis Center, where he would sit in a reclining chair while 2 large bore needles were inserted into the arteria venous fistula in his left arm, connecting him to a machine that would slowly filter his blood, removing the toxins and excess fluid that his body could no longer process independently. The procedure was exhausting, leaving him depleted and weak for the remainder of each treatment day, requiring Tuesday, Thursday, and the weekend for partial recovery before the cycle began again. The dialysis schedule had consumed more than just his time. It had reshaped every aspect of his existence. His wife Ruth had taken early retirement to drive him to treatments, to monitor his fluid intake, to prepare the special kidney-friendly meals that had replaced all the foods he'd once enjoyed. Their social life had evaporated, confined to the narrow windows between treatments when Charles had enough energy to participate. Travel had become impossible. Dialysis patients couldn't simply leave town without arranging treatment at certified facilities, a complex process that often made even short trips prohibitively complicated. Charles had been on the kidney transplant list for 6 years, but his age, his diabetes, and his overall health status had placed him far down the priority ranking. The waiting list for deceased donor kidneys averaged 7 to 10 years for patients in his demographic, and with each passing year, his eligibility decreased as his age and accumulated health complications mounted. Living donor transplants were theoretically possible, but despite testing, none of his family members had proven to be compatible matches, and the process of finding an altruistic donor seemed increasingly unlikely. The Family Feud application had been Ruth's idea, submitted during one of Charles's better weeks, when his energy levels had been higher than usual. Ruth had argued that appearing on their favorite game show would give them something positive to focus on, a family experience that could create joy amid the medical routine that dominated their lives. When the acceptance call came, Charles's first instinct had been to decline. The timing of television tapings rarely aligned with his dialysis schedule, and the physical demands of a full day in a television studio seemed potentially overwhelming. But Ruth had persisted with the gentle determination that had sustained their 42-year marriage. She'd coordinated with the dialysis center to reschedule his Friday treatment to Thursday evening, giving him maximum recovery time before the taping. She'd packed his medications, monitored his fluid intake, and arranged their travel schedule around his energy limitations. The trip to the studio represented more than just a television appearance. It was Ruth's attempt to reclaim a piece of the spontaneous, adventurous life that kidney failure had stolen from them. Steve Harvey approached the Washington family during the pre-show introductions with his characteristic warmth, but something about Charles's deliberate movements and the way Ruth hovered protectively nearby immediately caught Steve's attention. In decades of hosting, Steve had developed an instinct for reading people who were managing significant health challenges, and there was something about this 67-year-old man's careful energy conservation that suggested someone living with chronic illness. "Well, hello there, sir," Steve said, approaching Charles with respectful warmth. "What's your name? And tell me about your beautiful family here." "Charles Washington," he replied, his voice carrying the measured quality of someone who had learned to pace himself through conversations. "This is my wife, Ruth, my daughter, Michelle, and my son, David. We're here from Detroit, and this lady right here he gestured toward Ruth, with obvious affection, has been taking care of all of us for 42 years. Steve's trained eye caught subtle details that spoke to Charles's condition. The slight pallor that comes with chronic anemia, the way he shifted his weight to find comfortable positioning, the protective way his family arranged themselves around him. There was something about Charles's carefully managed energy that suggested someone whose vitality was being artificially maintained. "What do you do for work, Charles?" Steve asked, sensing that this man had stories worth hearing. "I was a high school principal for 30 years, Charles said with pride that momentarily energized his tired features. "Retired now, spending my time with family and, well, managing my health situation." The careful phrasing revealed volumes about how Charles had learned to discuss his condition without overwhelming listeners with medical details. Steve understood immediately that managing my health situation likely meant something far more complex and time-consuming than routine medical care. As the Washington family took their positions for the actual game, competing against the Chen family from California, Steve found himself paying as much attention to Charles's stamina levels as to the flow of the game. The older man participated enthusiastically when required, his answers thoughtful and often drawing from his decades of experience in education, but Steve could see the effort it cost him to maintain energy through the bright lights and sustained activity. During the first 2 rounds, Charles surprised everyone with his sharp responses despite his obvious fatigue. When Steve asked for things that require patience, Charles confidently answered, waiting for good news, earning a high spot on the board, but also revealing something profound about his experience with chronic illness and long-term hope. But it was during a commercial break before the final round that Steve witnessed something that would change his understanding of what some people carry in silence. While the cameras were off and crew members were adjusting equipment, Steve noticed Charles quietly checking his watch and making subtle calculations, the kind of automatic time management that spoke to someone whose life was governed by medical schedules. Ruth whispered something to Charles, and Steve saw him nod, then smile with the kind of gentle gratitude that passes between people who have learned to navigate serious illness together. The gesture was small but profound. A man whose life was controlled by medical machinery, taking a moment to appreciate the spontaneous joy that his condition had made increasingly rare. "Charles," Steve said quietly, during the break, approaching the family podium, "how are you feeling? This is a pretty energetic environment." Charles looked up, meeting Steve's eyes with the direct gaze of someone who had learned to be honest about limitations without surrendering dignity. "I'm managing," Charles said simply. "Some days are better than others. Today's a treatment day, so I'm running on borrowed energy." The phrase "borrowed energy" hit Steve with unexpected force. Here was a man whose vitality was literally dependent on medical intervention, whose body required mechanical assistance to perform functions that most people took for granted, but who was spending precious reserves to create joy for his family. The final round arrived with the Washington family holding a substantial lead, but Steve's focus had shifted entirely from the game to the man standing at the podium who was clearly pushing through physical limitations to participate in something meaningful for his loved ones. "We asked 100 people," Steve announced. "What does freedom mean to you?" It was Charles's turn at the podium. He stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate and careful, his hand gripping the podium for subtle support. His eyes met Steve's with an intensity that suggested this question had touched something deeply personal and painful. Steve repeated the question, his voice unconsciously gentling as he sensed this topic carried enormous weight for Charles. "What does freedom mean to you?" For a moment, Charles was silent, and Steve could see him wrestling with something larger than a game show answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear despite its quietness, carrying a wisdom that seemed to reach every person in the studio. "Freedom," Charles said, his words carefully chosen and heavy with meaning, "would be making plans without checking a dialysis schedule first. It would be sleeping through the night without calculating fluid intake. It would be traveling somewhere on impulse, eating what I want, living by my own clock instead of a machine's timing." His voice began to break slightly. "For 8 years I've been tied to a machine that keeps me alive, but sometimes I wonder if what I'm living can really be called a life." The studio fell completely silent. Not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for the next laugh, but the profound silence of hundreds of people collectively confronting the reality of medical dependence, of lives restructured around survival, of the difference between being alive and truly living. Steve's professional composure cracked visibly. His entertainer's mask gave way to something much more human as he processed the devastating honesty of Charles's response. Here was a man who had articulated something that millions of chronically ill people feel, but rarely voice: the tension between gratitude for life-sustaining treatment and grief for the independence that treatment requires them to surrender. Charles, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. How do you find the strength to keep going? Charles's response revealed the depth of his struggle and the source of his perseverance. Some days, I don't know if I'm strong or just stubborn, Charles said with heartbreaking honesty. Every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I get up and go to that center and let them stick needles in my arm because the alternative is dying. But it's not just about surviving anymore. It's about the people who need me to survive. Ruth gave up her retirement to take care of me. My kids rearranged their lives to help. If I give up, I'm not just giving up on myself. I'm giving up on everyone who's been fighting this battle with me. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation and every rule of television production. "Stop the music," Steve called out, his voice carrying an authority that immediately silenced everyone in the studio. "Stop everything right now." The Family Feud theme music cut out abruptly. The cameras continued recording, but every crew member understood that they were no longer producing entertainment. Steve walked away from his podium toward Charles, his movement deliberate and respectful, like someone approaching a moment of profound human truth about resilience, medical dependence, and the complex relationship between survival and dignity. The studio audience watched in complete silence as Steve approached this 67-year-old man who had just shared something devastatingly honest about the cost of staying alive when staying alive requires surrendering control over your own existence. Steve stopped in front of Charles, and for a moment the two men simply looked at each other. One who had spent his career creating joy for others, another who had spent 8 years redefining what joy could look like within the constraints of chronic illness. "Charles," Steve said gently, "I want you to listen to me. You said you wonder if what you're living can really be called a life. But Charles, what you're doing, getting up every Monday, Wednesday, Friday and choosing to fight for another few days, that's not just living. That's heroism. That's showing everyone around you what real courage looks like." He continued, his voice carrying conviction that seemed to reach something deep inside Charles's exhaustion. "You think you're tied to a machine? But Charles, you're not the machine's prisoner. You're a man who refuses to let a machine define the limits of your love, your contribution, your impact on the people around you. That dialysis doesn't make you less free. It makes you more determined to use whatever freedom you have to love your family, to create memories, to show up for the people who matter." Steve reached for Charles's shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "Freedom isn't about having no limitations, Charles. Freedom is about choosing what you do within whatever limitations you face. And brother, you've been choosing love, choosing family, choosing hope for 8 years. That's the freest man I've ever met." Charles's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since his diagnosis, he allowed himself to feel something other than resignation about his condition. "I've been so focused on what I can't do," he whispered. "I forgot to see what I'm still doing." "What you're still doing is extraordinary," Ruth called out from the family podium, her own voice thick with 8 years of accumulated emotion. "You're still here. You're still fighting. You're still the man I fell in love with, just with a few more appointments on your calendar." Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of shows, had made millions of people laugh, had built a career on bringing joy to others through entertainment. But standing with Charles Washington, he found himself confronting the reality that some victories aren't measured in prizes won or obstacles overcome, but in the daily choice to keep choosing life when life requires extraordinary effort. "Charles," Steve said, beginning to remove his suit jacket, "I want you to have something. This jacket has been with me through every Family Feud I've ever hosted. It's seen thousands of contestants, thousands of stories. But today, it's going home with someone who understands that the greatest victories aren't won on stages, but in the quiet moments when you choose hope over despair, love over surrender. As Steve wrapped the expensive garment around Charles's thin shoulders, the symbolism was clear to everyone present. This wasn't just a gesture of respect, it was a recognition that some forms of courage are invisible, that the most profound battles are fought, not in public arenas, but in dialysis chairs, not for applause, but for the privilege of another day with the people you love. This jacket belongs to someone who redefines freedom every single day, Steve said, his voice carrying across the silent studio. Someone who understands that independence isn't about not needing help. It's about choosing what you do with the help you receive. Someone who's been teaching his family for 8 years that love means showing up, even when showing up is hard. Charles pulled the jacket around himself, and for the first time in years, his relationship with his medical dependents shifted slightly. The dialysis schedule didn't feel quite so much like imprisonment, and more like the price he paid for the privilege of continued participation in the lives of people he cherished. Charles, Steve continued, I want you to understand something. You're not living a lesser life because you need that machine. You're living a life that requires more courage, more planning, more determination than most people can imagine. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you remarkable. Steve turned to address the entire studio audience, his voice carrying conviction that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something important. This man taught us something today, Steve announced. He taught us that freedom isn't about the absence of limitations, it's about what you choose to do with whatever freedom you have. He taught us that some people fight for their lives not once in dramatic moments, but 3 times a week, in quiet rooms, connected to machines, choosing survival because they understand that their lives matter to the people who love them. The applause that followed was unlike any sound the Family Feud studio had ever heard. It wasn't typical game show celebration, but something deeper, something that acknowledged the profound courage it had taken for Charles to share his truth and the grace with which he had learned to navigate an impossible situation. As the celebration continued around him, Charles stood in the center of it all, wearing Steve's jacket like a medal of honor, his family nearby with tears of pride and admiration. For the first time since his diagnosis, Charles wasn't thinking about all the freedoms he had lost. He was simply present in a moment of recognition that the freedoms he still possessed, the freedom to love, to hope, to create joy for his family, were worth the price he paid to maintain them. 18 months later, Charles Washington received a phone call that changed everything. A compatible kidney had become available, and after 8 years on dialysis, he was finally receiving the transplant that would restore his independence. The surgery was successful, and 6 months later, Charles called Steve Harvey to share the news that his creatinine levels were normal, his energy had returned, and for the first time in nearly a decade, he was making plans without consulting a medical schedule. Steve, Charles said, his voice stronger than it had been in years, I wanted you to thank you. What you said that day about choosing what to do with whatever freedom you have, that got me through the hardest months. I kept that jacket with me through every treatment, and it reminded me that I wasn't just surviving. I was living with purpose. How does it feel to have your freedom back, my friend? Steve asked, settling in for a conversation he'd treasure. Different than I expected, Charles replied with surprising wisdom. I thought freedom would feel like relief from the machine, but what it really feels like is gratitude for every extra day, for the family who fought with me, for the understanding that real freedom was never about the absence of the machine. It was about what I chose to do while I was connected to it. Steve smiled, remembering the exhausted man who had taught an entire television studio that the most profound courage isn't displayed in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to keep choosing life when life requires extraordinary effort. The jacket that Steve had given Charles became a treasured symbol in the kidney disease community, worn to dialysis sessions and transplant surgeries as a reminder that medical dependence doesn't diminish human dignity, that courage comes in many forms, and that some victories are measured not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulated days of choosing hope over despair. But the most important gift Charles received that day wasn't the jacket. It was the recognition that his battle with kidney disease wasn't a failure of independence, but a testament to the power of love, to sustain us through impossible circumstances. Because sometimes, A 67-year-old can teach an entire television studio that the greatest freedom isn't the absence of limitations, but the courage to live fully within whatever limitations we face. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Because sometimes the most important victories aren't won on stages or in competitions, but in dialysis chairs and hospital rooms, where people choose life not once but repeatedly, not for glory, but for love.